You can't even imagine the challenges that a case like this poses, which is so incredibly rare. We believe it may be the only rape and murder of a little girl in a church in the United States. Not to mention the fact that this truly was events that you could not script, presented such challenges, the perfect storm, in that there were at least 3 other initially credible suspects to this case. And no doubt, those facts impeded and thwarted the investigation through no fault of those investigators. But I cannot fail to recognize the Pennsylvania State Police, and a number of the command staff is here, and it's my privilege to have them here, and Captain Kelly will speak. For the years that followed, so Bristol Borough Police, and I have to commend them, I already did by mentioning Chief Faragelli, but every person who worked in that department that worked this case did their part, and Chief Moores is here and he'll speak as well. But the Pennsylvania State Police joined that investigation immediately following Carol Ann's murder, and they had allocated resources for the decades that followed, scrutinizing every physical piece of evidence with the hope that there would be a forensic break, with the hope that the developments in forensic science would allow for some breakthrough in this case. Although by and large that is not the case with our findings, I will touch upon there is a forensic aspect to our findings and conclusions. The work that was done to keep this alive was nothing short of remarkable. And forgive me for taking a moment. I can't fail to mention all of you, and Kay is going to mention 2 of you in particular, the members of the media. And I think for 2 of you it was personal. It wasn't just your professional obligation. You were motivated to make sure this case stayed alive, knowing that doing so, 1, could provide new leads, and 2, continue to reinforce the work we do, that we never forget our unsolved cases. So I thank all of you for that, and I thank you for being here today. And now to our findings, and it's going to be lengthy, forgive me. Typically you have a summary of our case, and it's really just an opportunity to answer the questions and cover it in broad strokes. So be patient with me as I summarize, and I'll certainly answer any questions. We're all here to answer any questions you may have. We know with specificity that Carol Ann went to school at St. Mark's, 5th grader, 9 years old. She went there like any other normal Monday in the fall, and she came home with plans to meet her friends at the library. She had 2 books she wanted to return. She had just completed those mystery books, and she was excited to get the next books in her series that she so loved. She was an avid reader. Typically, and this is a heartbreaking fact, she would typically bike into town. She lived in Bristol Township, just bordering Bristol Borough, about a mile from the center of town, and she would typically bike into town with her best friend who lived in her neighborhood, who was 2.5 years older. So a much significant age difference in that she was a 7th grader, an older child, and they were always together biking into the library as soon as their books were done. On this particular day, her friend was not going to the library with Carol Ann. Rather, Carol Ann was meeting 2 other friends at the library. We actually know with such clarity her path of travel that she got on her bike, a bike that we know she loved, her racing bike, her Londonier racing bike, and she biked past Jerome's Market, was seen by the owner of Jerome's, and then went into Tommy's Cafe, and again, a heartbreaking fact that she got a Coke and penny candy. I mean, could there be anything more innocent? Returning her library books, getting a Coke and penny candy. And she continued down Farragut, turning down Lincoln Avenue. And for those of you that know Bristol Borough, we know that Lincoln Avenue runs adjacent to St. Mark's Catholic Church, where it meets Radcliffe. Unbeknownst to Carol Ann, and unbeknownst to everyone in Bristol Borough, living on Lincoln Avenue was an absolute predator. And a predator who his prey was little girls, and that is William Schrader. William Schrader was a man residing on Lincoln Avenue, just a block and a half from St. Mark's, less than a 5-minute walk from the church. And I'm going to go into his history. And forgive me, his history is going to be very difficult to hear. William Schrader was someone who was a transplant to Bucks County. He grew up in Luzerne County. And thanks to the investigative work done by this team, we know by age 8, he was a boy who was violently assaulting and targeting little girls. He would literally club little girls in the face, and it resulted in him being placed in a reform school. His behavior was so bad in the reform school that he spent the entirety of his youth in and out of reform school in his home county. Ultimately, at the age of 17, just before his 18th birthday, he enlisted into the Army. He was dishonorably discharged a year later. We know that upon his discharge, he committed an attempted murder where he attempted to shoot another man. Thankfully, that man survived. But we know that William Schrader's behavior was so violent while incarcerated pending prosecution for that case that the recommendation was a state sentence to be imposed. And of course, that state sentence was in fact imposed, and he served his time at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. We know then he is released from incarceration after serving his time, and he establishes roots in Bristol Borough, where his brother Frank and his sister-in-law Carolyn were residing with their family on Lincoln Avenue. We also know that he was at times staying at the Bristol House, which is a kind of house for transients, closer to the center of town, closer to the wharf, I should say. We know that William Schrader's history of sexually violating little girls, it's the likes I have never seen as a career child abuse prosecutor. We know that William Schrader spent the entirety of his 62 years, from 8 at least to 62, violating little girls in ways that are unimaginable. And I'm going to jump around a bit, but it's important to know his history to understand the facts of this crime. William Schrader was not initially a target of this investigation. In the first few days and hours and weeks that followed the murder of Carol Ann, there were other suspects identified. So William Schrader managed to get away with murdering Carol Ann, and actually initially stayed in the Bristol Borough area. But it wasn't until January of '63, so about 2.5 months later, that a concerned citizen saw something suspicious, something he believed was relevant to the murder of Carol Ann, which was unsolved still, clearly. And he reported this stranger cutting through his backyard, acting suspicious. And that was the first time we know William Schrader was on the police radar. And at that point in time, they did something critical. They interviewed him. Of course, he lied about his whereabouts, claiming to have worked on the day that Carol Ann was murdered, which we know, in fact, he was not at work. He was not at work for 3 straight days. But he also was asked to provide a pubic hair sample. 141 pubic hair samples were collected and tested in this case throughout the decades, and I'll get to that. Unfortunately, we were not fortunate enough to get a DNA extraction, but still, we had credible forensic evidence as it relates to the pubic hairs that were collected. And the reason why police collected pubic hairs, another heartbreaking detail, is we know that when Carol Ann was raped, her clothes were removed from her lower portion of her body. She was naked from the waist down, her shirt and undershirt pushed up. We believe a sock was stuffed in her mouth to keep her from screaming, and we know that she had clutched in her hand pubic hairs, and on her thigh a pubic hair from the perpetrator that committed this unthinkable crime. So I commend the efforts from 1962 through last week. We know that microscopic hair comparison was not advanced in 1962. It later became a technique that was more sophisticated and more reliable. And I'll get into the specifics, but in short, out of the 141 pubic hairs analyzed from 141 different sources, only one person could not be eliminated as a contributor. And that's the standard that the forensic scientists with the Pennsylvania State Police Lab used. That's the highest standard in that type of analysis, cannot be eliminated. And that was William Schrader's pubic hair sample. But independent of that, developed throughout the years were eyewitnesses that put him outside of the church. 20 years later, a friend came forward indicating that he knows there's information he has that he failed to share, and this friend lost his own daughter, and he finally came forward and told the Bristol Borough Police Department that he saw William Schrader outside of the church right before Carol Ann would have been murdered. Independent of the neighbor, Daniel DiMidio, who was the original source to put William Schrader on the radar of the police, and independent of the lab experts looking at the pubic hair samples that were collected throughout the decades. But what we can tell you next is, again, the part that's going to be hard to hear. We know that when William Schrader in January of '63 finally realized he was a suspect, he immediately fled the area. He had no ties to the South, but he fled to Florida, where he almost immediately engaged in criminal activity in Florida, then fled Florida to Texas, where again, He engaged in violent and disruptive criminal activity in in Texas, and then ultimately found himself in Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, where he established roots. We know while there, he married a woman by the name of Audrey Schrader. He met Audrey through her adult son, who was only a few years younger than William, who was a fellow inmate in a county correctional facility in Terrebonne Parish. When William Schrader married Audrey, almost immediately, he began to rape her two special needs daughters, one who was a young adult and one who was a minor, clearly suffering from a cognitive impairment that would prevent both of them from being able to consent, and this man also was their stepfather. We know when he raped his one stepdaughter, she conceived a child, and that child was a little girl, the biological child of William Schrader. And when that little girl, his step-granddaughter and biological child, reached the age of 8, she too became a victim of his sexual abuse, ongoing for years. It didn't just stop with his own stepchildren and granddaughter, or step-granddaughter and biological child. He sexually abused the next generation of children in his family. Individuals who had the courage to come forward and interview our detectives in this case and confide in their deepest, darkest secrets, things that they were ashamed of. In addition to that, though, perhaps the most troubling fact that we learned was that William Schrader and Audrey Schrader first were fostering a 2-year-old little girl in their home, not a biological relative, but ultimately Audrey Schrader adopts this child, but they were also allowing a 12-year-old neighbor to reside in their home. And that 12-year-old neighbor was a little girl by the name of Catherine Smith. It was known that William was sneaking into the bedroom where Catherine resided temporarily in their home with the 2-year-old child, so Catherine was told to lock the bedroom door at night so she couldn't be victimized. On Halloween of all dates, 1970, William Schrader and his wife Audrey Schrader get into a violent domestic dispute where he assaults Audrey, his wife. Her adult son, Tommy LeBlanc, confronts his stepfather and throws him out of the house. What William Schrader does and says next is unimaginable. He gets his belongings and he says, "I'm coming back and I'm gonna burn the house down and kill all of the bitches inside it." And we know that night there's an intentional fire set at the Schrader home, and we know the adults were able to get out of that home, but the 2 little girls in that bedroom where the door was locked at night to prevent them from being victimized, Catherine from being victimized by William Schrader, could not get out because of that locked door. And we know that Catherine Smith ended up dying in the fire. The 12-year-old child that we believe he was victimizing died. And perhaps just another heartbreaking but remarkable fact is it's believed that Catherine Smith put her body on top of 2-year-old, I won't name her name, but a 2-year-old child. And as a result, that 2-year-old little girl survived that fire. But you can't even imagine, and probably again, something so heartbreaking for all of us is that 2-year-old little girl grows up to be old enough just to be victimized again by William Schrader. So the generational sexual abuse that this man inflicted upon every female, child, and woman in his life, he didn't stop until the day he died. And he died at age 62 in 2002. One of the things, though, we know is that, one, his family came forward and provided truthful information about the murder of Catherine Smith, and ultimately, years later, he was arrested and prosecuted. He was convicted of manslaughter and arson, but nonetheless, he served state time. All the while, Bucks County law enforcement was still keeping Carol Ann's case alive. We know that William Schrader also confided in a family member, and that family member, Robert LeBlanc, another stepson, came forward to law enforcement in Louisiana, confiding in a member he trusted, saying his stepfather, William Schrader, admitted to raping and murdering a little girl in a Catholic church in Pennsylvania, in the town that he lived before he fled to the South. Unfortunately, that information did not make its way to the current team of investigators until many years later, but once they learned about this confession, Robert LeBlanc was still very much alive and still very much living in the home where the conversation was had. At least on 2 separate occasions, William Schrader admitted to him that he had done this and got away with it. And they interviewed him. And he was consistent. And what he said was that William Schrader committed this crime in a Catholic church, as mentioned, and killed the little girl because he feared she would reveal what he had done. So he had to kill her, and that's why he fled the area. So we secured that statement, that confession. And again, to be mindful, that confession occurred independent of the eyewitness Domidio, independent of the eyewitness friend who put him outside the church, independent of the forensic analysis of the pubic hair, and ultimately, and I'm just scratching the surface of the investigation, we were able to put this case into the grand jury. And we could not stop without adding an expert who's renowned in child sexual victim behavior, but also the assessment and classification of sexual offenders, Dr. Veronique Valliere, and you'll hear briefly from her. And she educated all of us and the jury on character traits from individuals that commit heinous crimes like this, the likes we rarely see. And one of the quotes I just want to share, and she'll certainly say more, and she's brilliant. She said, "For sex offenders who have violence as a character trait, which is a subset of offenders that is rare, their need to gratify their desires outweighs everything else. They see the world as a place to exploit. Such a worldview facilitates violence." And of course, the likes we rarely see, like this rape and murder of Carol Ann, and she'll speak more to that. But then, most importantly, this woman, Kay Talanka, Carol Ann's sister, we couldn't tell her that we believed we solved the case and that we're in the grand jury with the evidence we believe that paints a clear picture. And so she had blind trust in us, and she came in and testified, and she shared her personal account. And one of the things I'll never forget for as long as I live is that she wasn't even 3, but put in that car with her mom and dad who drove to the church to look for her sister, and she remembers her dad coming out and making noises that didn't sound human, keening and moaning and grieving, and pleading with his wife, "Do not go into that church. Don't see our daughter like that." And she remembers it and described it clearly for our jurors and for the rest of us. And she just also described the profound impact it defined the rest of her life and her family's lives, quite frankly, and still does to this day. And I commend her because she came in and showed such courage. And without that courage, I don't know that we would have been able to explain to the court, which was so important. They allowed us to use this proceeding, which is an arm of the court, the grand jury. And there's a reason, there's a function it has to serve. Beyond just finding the truth, to release it to the public, it has to be understood that this impact is so great. And who could have a greater impact than to Carol Ann's family? But also to the community. This defined our community. It's one of the worst cases this region has ever seen, perhaps maybe even country has ever seen. And Kay did that so bravely. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking because, quite frankly, it's not about me, it's not about us, those that helped get this case to where it needs to be. It's truly about Kay and her family.